Hey, Kelly, Tommy Givens here, professor of the course. Hope you're hanging in there with all of the craziness here in our LA area. If I remember right, you're down south in Orange County somewhere. So hopefully not quite as bad where you are. But despite all the storm raging around us, here we are in this class, and thankful for your work here in week one. I thought I'd send along a video reply just to say hello a little more directly and kind of get our conversation started. So you've got some wonderful responses in both of the forums, and I want to just highlight a few things that I think might be sort of seeds of ongoing insight as you continue to study the rest of Matthew. Some of what you've seen, you've already actually indicated this, the way that pieces of Israel's memory, whether in the genealogy or in what you read in the Old Testament, really come to fruition in a variety of ways in Matthew's gospel. So, want to highlight a few things that I think are going to do that, especially here out of your responses. Um, the first, I think, is I'm looking here at the response in Forum One, and it is that God loves God's people, Israel, uh, and does not give up on the people when they abandon God, when they rebel, when they are unfaithful. And we're going to see this same faithfulness in Jesus, who is God with us. He doesn't disown his people in their sins, he joins them in being baptized for the forgiveness of sins, joining them in confessing these intergenerational patterns of sin that they have inherited and that have made their life so hard in the land in his day, in the waters of baptism there with John at the beginning. And that solidarity with his people in their sin, in their injustice, in their suffering, is what occasions his being anointed by God the Father as the sort of final human heir of God's ruling power on the earth, the Son of God. So you've hit on something here that I think is especially key to who Jesus is. Obviously, this will intensify this solidarity with his people as the drama of Matthew unfolds and culminates in his predicting these terrible kind of fires of judgment, destruction coming on the near horizon before his generation passes away, but then opts to die the very death that is coming to his people in the closing scenes of Matthew's gospel. So he doesn't refuse the judgment that he announces and embodies in some ways for his people. Instead, he endures that judgment himself. And that, Matthew tells us, is the sort of life that leads to resurrection life on the earth, that forever Sabbath, as I think you delightfully put it at the end here of your response in Forum One. So I just I accentuate this at this stage because of what it's going to do in Matthew's gospel, but also because it gets at what I have as a sort of structural pain point in the Christian tradition as I've experienced it. And that is a sort of life that is idealized. We imagine that being the church or something means that we're faithful to God when other people are not. And we often tell a kind of triumphalist story of the church. And subtly, we are exerting all kinds of pressure on ourselves and on others to live up to some ideal, to repress sins that threaten our belonging or sense of actually um, being that ideal. And it makes our relationships and our life together just burdened, I think, with all kinds of repressed insecurity, defensiveness, whatever. And it cuts against what we learn about how Jesus is God with us. It's not a matter, obviously, of kind of saying it doesn't matter how we live. I mean, you have pointed out here in this response how God is angered by Israel's sin. Jesus, as we know in Matthew, rebukes his disciples for their uh, pride, their competitiveness, their unfaithfulness. But it's not a rebuke of if you don't get with the program, you don't belong. Or if you don't do what you're supposed to do, I will forsake you, which is often, I think, the subtext of a lot of Christian teaching, and maybe even some of the social dynamics that we embody. Jesus tells his disciples as he's going to his own death that they're going to all desert him. Uh, they're going to betray him and deny him, and yet he will not forsake them. He will not give up on them, no matter what. And that is the hope, I think, for his disciples, for their people, finally for all the peoples of the world, is a God of that kind of mercy and steadfastness, even when we are unfaithful. So rather than inspiring faithfulness, by threatening us with being abandoned or, permanently separated from God or something like that, what inspires faithfulness, according to Matthew, and I think the teaching of the Old Testament that Matthew builds on, is God's undying love for us and for others. This actually comes out a little bit now that I'm thinking of it in the way you talk about Gentile people in the genealogy. Um, and you may have caught in my chapter my worry that, Christians often talk about these Gentile mothers of Jesus as sort of questionable women associated with sexual infidelity, etc. But if you read closely, in fact, each of these women is associated with um, powerful Israelite men, some of whom treat some of them terribly. And so in Jewish tradition, actually, unlike the Christian tradition, they're remembered as faithful Gentile women who were vindicated against some of Israel's own ancestors of renown and showed the ways of Israel's God with Gentile people who were used by God to call Israel back and were themselves vindicated as the ways of faith themselves. So that tells us something important about these dynamics of faithfulness and unfaithfulness in Israel. Jesus doesn't actually spend a lot of time relating to Gentiles in Matthew. I love that you've quoted here at the end, Matthew 12, in his name the Gentiles will hope. If you look there, that's right out of Isaiah, right? But if you look there in Matthew, this quotation from Isaiah 42 comes in the midst of something that doesn't have anything apparently to do directly with Gentile people. Jesus encounters a centurion in Matthew who is a kind of paragon of faith, but it's a centurion who lives in Capernaum, where Jesus has settled and has a whole history there, etc. His encounter with a Canaanite mother is the only other really colorful one before the end of Jesus's life in Matthew. And that one's actually kind of hard and difficult. Jesus treats her harshly in some ways. Um, so there's not this kind of concerted, what we might imagine we would find Gentile mission or something. And I think that is because what Matthew assumes, and in fact shows, is that the hope of Gentile peoples in the world lies in the way that God is faithful to Israel, even when Israel is unfaithful. And that's what those mothers of David and Jesus show from the genealogy. And maybe that's important for us. We tend to instrumentalize, I think, sometimes being disciples of Jesus, people of God, in terms of mission and service to others, all of which, of course, has its place and is part of the picture that we get. but we overlook that God reveals God's self to people, to Israel, to Jesus' disciples, to us, uh, out of delight, simply because God wishes to bless and enjoy and inspire that enjoyment and delight in return. And the mission that we have as God's people, um, the calling that we have to serve others, has, I think, to be integrated into that sense that being the people of God is being called into a family and community of enjoyment and delight and celebration and worship and rest, as opposed to what we sometimes assume, which is that it's primarily just suffering whatever we have to spread the gospel, spread um, all kinds of good things to other people. And it leaves us, I think, with some psychological and social wounds and difficulties when we imagine God's revelation that way. So, you got some great inspiration, as you can tell here, at least for me, in what you've written. And I hope that the seeds that you're planting here in this first week's work, which you've done so well, will bear more fruit as you're following some of these thematic lines through Matthew's gospel, and then maybe teasing out, as I've been trying to do a little bit here, how our life is at stake in this story and how we tell it. Great to have you in the class again. Looking forward to get to know you. Don't know if you're too far from Fuller to make the trip on the days we're going to have in-person classes. If that's the case, no problem. But I'm hoping that anyone in the area will be able to come. I think we're going to do Thursdays 12 to 2. Maybe not this Thursday. I haven't decided yet because they just told me the campus is closed. But I don't know. Maybe we'll meet across the street from the campus at California Pizza Kitchen or something. I do hope that we can, as many of us as possible who live nearby, have at least some conversation together in person. So welcome again, and thanks for your hard work here in week one.